Everybody knows Maduro was extracted and, let's say, forcefully extradited to the United States. Um, you know what's difficult about all this, Sam, is whenever something like this happens, the internet just floods with narratives. You have, political ideologies informing one side and the other. But, you're a guy who's on the inside. You have a lot of sources in the US administration, inside of different agencies. What were the grounds for Maduro's removal from Venezuela, as far as you understand it?
Yeah, I've been writing about there's an indictment that goes back to 2020 that talks about how Maduro and senior generals, former generals, military intelligence have been essentially leveraging Venezuela as a narco state. So,
Yeah.
and being directly involved in drug dealing. This is not just corruption, but the allegations from the US government under the Trump administration, which were carried forward, and the reward for Maduro's capture was raised by the Biden administration. So this is a US justice. And at the end of the day, of course, there's a military component, which we can get into. But the allegations are he was giving the usage of Venezuelan planes, Venezuela's state oil company, his own presidential hangar. He and his wife, who's in charge, she's a lawyer, she's in charge of, the whole justice system, had their own drug dealing gang and were intentionally, the allegations are, targeting the United States with drug shipments as part of not only a profiteering exercise, but as a kind of hybrid war, working with other bad people to destabilize the United States. So to expand it a little further, the updated superseding indictment was unsealed hours after they reveal that special forces extracted Maduro.
Yeah.
In a highly, highly successful operation, which, my comment is it's much like the B-2 strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities. It's just like incredible what the US government can do. But the new indictment says that Maduro, his son, various intelligence bosses from the military were running thousands and thousands of tons of cocaine up into North America. We've talked before about how Ryan Wedding and his network with the Sinaloa cartel, and I say Hezbollah money launderers, were running drugs through Margarita Island, which is part of Venezuela. So this indictment just packs that all together. And that's, I know that people come to me for some credibility and authority now, and I'm saying the US government can easily prove the allegations against Maduro because they have already convicted people that are part of his conspiracy, have been convicted in New York and admitted to being part of this drug enterprise. So as we see, this case move through courts, I think you will see, former generals that have been convicted and taken some sort of plea dealings will be up on the stand, or will have notarized evidence saying, yeah, I was part of this deal. Maduro was there. His son was there. You'll have DEA tape recordings of, confidential DEA sources or officials that infiltrated the network talking on tape recordings of basically the bribes going across, the Western Hemisphere and these drug deals. So it's a slam dunk case.
So was Maduro and his gang operating independently, or were they operating in tandem with other groups? I mean, obviously they were, but do we know who those other groups were, and do we know what the connection was?
Yeah, the new superseding indictment unsealed this past week says that Maduro's enterprise was working with TDA, Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan designated now narco terror group, which is, deeply embedded across the United States, also in Canada. And their leader, I'll just give you an example. The indictment says provided, boating and transportation facilities for Maduro's drug dealing enterprise out of Venezuela. The court filings say the Sinaloa cartel is mixed up in the dealings with with Maduro's gang, and which is called. There's some controversy around this. The cartel of the Suns, meaning members of Maduro's cartel are generals that have a sun badge on their arm. Some people, give more or less credence to that, but there's no doubt that TDA, Sinaloa cartel, FARC, ELN, these are narco terror drug trafficking groups in Colombia, which are a big part of the enterprise. And just to tie it all off, a piece of the indictment that brings it all together says that two unnamed, actually, two relatives of Maduro are caught on tape recordings with DEA officers or sources talking about how they're moving drugs through Margarita Island, how Maduro's son, whose nickname is the Prince, would fly into Margarita Island on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, where the army had set up, basically parties for the Venezuelan government elite. Maduro's son would fly in on the state oil company plane, which would be used for, to package up drugs on Margarita Island and then to deal them off to North America. And another piece of that, there's a guy that comes into this. I believe his name is, it's escaping me. It's a Middle Eastern name, but he's a big part, allegedly, of the Maduro enterprise. This is named in the indictment. And while it's not named in the indictment, further U.S. government, U.S. Treasury sanctions reporting tie this guy and another, Middle Eastern figure in the Venezuela regime to Hezbollah. So we've probably talked before how there's all kinds of U.S. government reporting and intelligence that says that the Iranian regime and Hezbollah are working with Venezuelan drug dealers, including Maduro, on Margarita Island.
Yeah, so I kind of want to draw a bit of a map here, because something interesting happened early in Trump's second term. That was early in 2025. They locked down the Panama Canal, which China had largely taken over. Now, Venezuela, interestingly enough, has some very deep connections to China. And Sam, correct me if I'm wrong here, but what it looks like to me in Latin America right now, there's another component to this as well, that China's Belt and Road Initiative took over or picked up where the United States CIA sponsored and military coups in South America left off. So when the U.S. and the IMF and the World Bank kind of picked up and moved on from Latin America, the China's Belt and Road Initiative moved in. So what it looks like to me as an observer, as a reader of your reporting, and just a guy who understands a little bit about the world despite my very obvious mental deficiencies, it looks to me like Trump and the Americans are in the process of purging China out of Latin America. Have you seen the same thing?
That is absolutely happening. They're purging China, and they're purging Cuban intelligence, which is another big story of how embedded throughout the Western Hemisphere Cuban intelligence is. That includes, a lot of well-connected people in the United States in various industries. We've talked before about how, these Marxist groups have been very embedded in North America, into our culture wars in ways that are really not well understood.
Yeah.
But Cuban intelligence is very much involved in that. And so, the Trump administration, from Marco Rubio saying, we're going to take back Panama, either the person we've talked about Hutchison Whampoa, this, we never named the Hong Kong tycoon because we don't need to, but he's very much a part of, the narrative in my book, Willful Blindness, and how this guy from Hong Kong and his friends set up very deeply in Vancouver's real estate and port, and are set up very well on ports and on the west coast of Mexico. They own Hutchison Whampoa essentially have set up on both ends of the choke points of the canal. And so Marco Rubio saying, we're going to take that back from China and its proxies, or else. That's what's going on there. What you point to, the purge of Chinese port infiltration, which, as you and I have talked about, I put Vancouver Chinese port infiltration in the same category, if not the same degree, as Chinese Mexican port infiltration, Chinese infiltration of Venezuela and its infrastructure, Panama, Belize, Peru, Nicaragua. We can go on and on. So there's a little, I'll end my answer to you with this anecdote. You know, when I was digging into the Trump administration's accusations against Canada as a vector for fentanyl in the past year, and there was all this denial reporting from the CBC and Globe and Mail, etc., I talked to a senior American official. This time I couldn't name them, but I did a number of long read interview stories on the Bureau. And the person told me, look, you'd have to be crazy to think that J.D. Vance would be flying up to Greenland. Marco Rubio would be talking about taking back Panama or else. President Trump would be saying, thank you for your attention to this matter, Canada. Tariffs, stop the fentanyl or else. This was a year ago. I was hearing that this is real because the U.S. government is so concerned about war with China that its doctrine is controlling its backyard, so that if they have to go kinetic with China, they know they're secure in the Western Hemisphere. So that's what's going on now. And so I had this insight from a senior level at the U.S. government that this kind of wild action we're seeing at the start of 2026 would unroll. Did I know that special forces with the parent sonic weapons, whether we know that's true or not, with 20 people would be able to overcome, from dozens to hundreds of, Venezuelan and Cuban guards? I didn't know anything to that level, but I knew that major events would start unfolding, over the past year, and here we are.
There's this romantic, easily digestible narrative that gets pushed out in legacy media whenever something like this happens, right? That America has swooped in to bring freedom and democracy to Venezuela, and the Panama Canal will always belong to the United States, and they're just taking back what belongs to them. Everything is always distilled down into these easily digestible, easy to understand narratives, but I think it does the actual story a disservice, because what you see unraveling from those narratives or stemming out from those narratives is all of this arguing on, small, minute, really unimportant details on social media. And Sam, this is what I've surmised by everything that I'm seeing happening. What we're experiencing or witnessing right now is a Cold War between two empires. You have China and the United States, the U.S. being the old empire, the global hegemon for the last, 50 years, and China racing toward the finish line to global dominance. And the United States with a president who is just wild and crazy enough to do some of this stuff. They recognize that their window, their ability to move on this and cut the head off the snake is getting shorter and shorter and shorter as the days go by. And so now the US is racing to stop China from succeeding in their quest for global dominance. And that's what this is all about. This is about two empires engaged in a Cold War. Do you see it the same way?
Absolutely. We talked before. I pointed, our listeners to, there's a video clip, a literal video clip from, I believe, 2023 of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping meeting outside a Russian facility. And it's after a dinner or something. And Putin says, we are seeing opportunities that we have not seen in 100 years. And Xi says, I agree. So they both, Xi and Putin, believe that their empires should be global hegemons. Xi has a realistic chance. Putin, at this point, he's deluded. He's not going to get there, but he'll burn everything down to try to get there. So those two have agreed, along with Iran and North Korea, that now is the time to push to overcome what was called the Western rules-based order that came out of World War II and, Ronald Reagan winning the Cold War. And so you're right. Everyone, the best analysis I've seen is that the West has squandered the sort of decades that followed Ronald Reagan's, drive and essential victory over the Soviet Empire. And the peace dividend, this was, everyone was getting fat, rich, and lazy in the West. This is where the whole globalism that, we talk about and that you often look into came from. That is rich people in cities in the West pushing their governments to increase trade with these, states. People were arguing, this is the end of history. The West won. Now it's all about international trade. Everyone gets rich. But that wasn't what was happening. People like Xi were coldly biding their time, using that internationalism and global trade to steal Western technology. And here we are. So you're right. It's now the US government has, I believe, that their strategy is a renewal of the Monroe Doctrine. When and if war breaks out, around Taiwan, they want to have the West locked down. They want to have Greenland as a beachhead against, in my view, as we both probably agree, Canada has squandered any chance of being, a responsible state and holding up its end of the northern hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. And so this is why Trump and J.D. Vance are trying to buy Greenland, right? It's a very, very more than enough good analysts have said we're in like 1939 or 1938. If this is going to be the next major war.
We're going to get to Greenland in a minute because that's another important piece to this puzzle. What I'm trying to do is bring this all together for our listeners so that they can understand what they're seeing. I wrote a little piece about it on X the other day, but I really want to talk to you because you're the expert. And the thing that's really been disappointing to me is I'm seeing a lot of journalists that I highly respect, people like Glenn Greenwald, getting this wrong, completely misunderstanding what's happening. This isn't just regime change for the sake of resources, right? Like this is, you close down the Panama Canal to China and Russia. You shut down Venezuela. You are cutting off some serious resources that China would require in order to mobilize against Taiwan, Japan, potentially the US in the future, right?
Exactly. 3 to 4 at tops, 5% or more of Venezuela's oil was going to China. Something like 25 to 30% from Iran to China. Russia with all its ghost ships, is all mixed up in that. So again, if you do buy the theory that we are very close to China, if China saw any weakness from the United States right now, Xi has promised he's going to take Taiwan by force, or as they would prefer, by the rest of the world just saying it's yours. Right. And as we've talked about, he wants the PLA to be ready operationally by 2027. So that's that breakneck race we're talking about. Yeah. The US government, there's a guy, people can look him up. Elbridge Colby, I believe is his name. His dad was a former, I believe, high-level CIA or another security agency. And he is the author of this doctrine of secure your backyard. So the Western Hemisphere, pull your assets out of Ukraine. The US government, in his view, only has so many warheads and munitions, and they need to be ready for China. So that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, and you can see how they're fortifying, right? You have Javier Milei now in Argentina, who's a friend of the Trump administration. You have Nayib Bukele in, oh my God, why am I blanking on this? El Salvador or Guatemala? Yeah. El Salvador. Another friend of the Trump administration. Maduro's gone. I was listening to your conversation with Brian Lilly as I was speeding up the highway to get here, and it looks like Mikado is not cooperating with the United States. So who knows who's going to end up in that position. But see, this is the point that I'm trying to make here, is that this is an empire game that was classically purposely obfuscated by the American administrations for good reason, because it's dirty and most people won't like it. And even myself, I wrote extensively on this for a number of years. I was vehemently against regime change in foreign nations for this empire game that the United States is playing. But this time it's different.
Until you and I lived at the forefront of a Chinese hybrid warfare operation in Vancouver and saw the alternative.
That's right. See, this time it's different because although the American empire is messy and dirty and bloody at times, the alternative, living underneath a Chinese global hegemon, is far worse. And that's what I wrote on X yesterday, was that, in a world controlled by America, we have an enemy to fight, and Glenn Greenwald is free to fight it. In a world ruled by China, Glenn Greenwald doesn't exist.
He's that's disappeared.
That's
China. Yeah, he's disappeared.
That's the difference. So we find ourselves in this weird place where this empire game that the United States has been playing for 50, 60 years, now, previously, I was against it. I was vehemently outspoken about what the United States and its intelligence agencies were doing around the world. But now I see that America has to win. They have to win. And that they're getting dirty, and it's the same old America game. It's the same old brute force, right? Blunt force trauma. Keep your head spinning while they take everything that they need. But again, it is preferable to the alternative. You do not want a world run by China.
Yeah, and I think another piece of the Western Hemisphere operations that are starting to unfold is China using that peace dividend that was squandered in the globalization era by the West, has secured critical minerals. Everything from, whatever runs our AI chips, to actual gunpowder, antimony, or whatever, is put in like the low level munitions. And so the US government absolutely is putting a huge ton of pressure on Canada, Greenland, up and down South America to secure deals so that in a war, China will not be able to own and produce all the munitions. The United States will not have to go over to Europe or Asia and say, can we buy this from you? They'll have control of enough critical minerals across the Western Hemisphere. So again, I think that's part of the Greenland picture, part of the Venezuela picture, part of the Canada picture, probably. It's not just all about counter drugs or military preparation or oil. Critical minerals are a big piece of it. And the fact that China essentially controls that supply chain.
Well, it just seems to me like the Trump administration were waiting to pounce on Venezuela, and the drug thing is 100% a pretext. I personally don't believe they care they do, obviously, and they've made it a point that they do care about the flow of fentanyl through the United States. But I think China is at the core of it and trying to root them out of our continent. Right.
I agree. And we only have to look at John Molinar, head of the Congressional CCP Select Committee. He put out a post on X after that operation and said, essentially, China was behind all the ill dealings in Venezuela, and our Congressional Committee will work with our allies to continue to investigate and root out CCP influence in the Western Hemisphere. So that's the proof of your point right there. I do think drugs, is a pretty big part of it, that vector. But the denial of oil and the CCP behind it all, using Venezuela and other proxy states, is the major factor. Yeah.